Welcome to Conversations with B'nai B'rith International. I'm CEO Dan Mariaschin. Thank you for spending some time with us today. With me today to discuss his new book, The Night Archer and Other Stories, is Ambassador Michael Oren, who served as Israeli ambassador to the United States from 2009 to 2013, a crucial time in the U.S.-Israel relationship. A statesman, historian, author, former member of Knesset, he has dedicated his life to serving Israel and the Jewish people. Ambassador Oren has been and remains one of the most powerful voices defending Israel in the media as well. As an author, his last three books, 6 Days of War, Power, Faith, and Fantasy, about America and the Middle East, and Ally, My Journey Across the American-Israel Divide, were all New York Times bestsellers. Today, Ambassador Oren will speak with me about his new book, a collection of short fiction that explores the bounds of imagination and human emotions. We'll discuss how his experiences as an ambassador, cabinet member, politician, and historian informed his creative writing process. Ambassador Oren, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Always good to be with you, Dan. We go way back. Hi again.
We do indeed. I want to start with your introduction to the book, because your introduction says that when you were 12 years old, you were writing poetry at that age. Right. You say that poetry was not a ramble of unbridled thoughts, but a vision bound by structure, meter, and rhyme. Real freedom, I internalized then, was only attainable through limits. And then you conclude by saying, much like verse, short fiction imposes draconian strictures on the author, necessitating constant discipline. Now, as an academic and a historian, you've written books about history, and you now turn to the short story genre. What caused you to make that switch?
Well, I actually nothing caused me to make the switch. I always made the switch. I started off as a poet. I started writing short stories, I think, in junior high school, and I've written them on and off throughout my life. The rub was that as a public figure, I couldn't publish them. Okay, there are parts of the American government that are very similar. You can write, but you can't publish. So these are stories actually written during my time in Knesset, when I was in the Israeli government, and now's the chance to publish them. And so, but what I do say in this introduction, something I feel very, very strongly about, Dan, is that writing in general is very Jewish, and short stories are the ultimate Jewish form. And it really has to do with freedom, that writing is freedom, enables me, the writer, to be anybody I want to be, wherever I want to be at any time, the ultimate freedom. But with that freedom comes restrictions. And that's a very Jewish concept. It's a concept that, you can get out of Egypt and you're going to have your exodus, but you're going to end up in Sinai. And the only way to truly safeguard your freedom is through restrictions, through law. We Jews have this holiday called Passover, probably the only holiday in the world that celebrates freedom, but it imposes on us all these additional restrictions to handle down that thought. And that Jewish paradox of freedom, which, by the way, is hardwired into the U.S. Constitution with checks and balances, is something that it's a Jewish gift to the world, I believe. And since writing is I think our greatest legacy, we don't have much of a artistic legacy. There's no great ancient Jewish art, and there's a lot of talk about music in the Bible, but we don't know what it sounds like. What we do have is literature, and what we have is short stories. The Bible is a collection of short stories, so it's really quite to me, I think it's very much within the Jewish tradition, is writing these stories, and I feel it's something I do as part of my Jewish identity.
Well, when you were writing history, you have to take a lot of time. You've got to research. You've got to check all kinds of facts. When you're writing short stories and writing fiction, this is an entirely different kind of motivation, a different kind of research. It's kind of a research of the mind in terms of originality and creativity. Explain the difference between the two.
Well, writing history or writing op-eds, I write a great deal of op-eds. It usually comes from like here up, and where fiction comes from here down. And I can sit down and write, an hour and a half, 2 hours of fiction in the morning, then go immediately to writing nonfiction, and it doesn't bother me at all because it comes from different parts of the brain, the heart, the soul. But it's interesting question is that a lot of these stories draw on my background as an historian or as a statesman or a politician, and they required research. And having the skills of an historian, very important. I'll just give you one example. One of my favorite stories is not an easy story. It's called Metaxas. And it's about, it takes place in 1841 along the American frontier at the foothills of the Rocky Mountains. And it takes place in an American military fort. And it's in the form of a dispatch written by the commander of this fort to his senior officer. So in order to get this story right, not only do I have to know something about the uniforms and the weapons and the way the U.S. Army was run in 1841, but I had to actually go back and read dispatches from the American frontier from the 1840s in order to get the language right. I wanted to get the language right. And if you read this story, the way the letter is set up, the dispatch is exactly the way dispatches were written in the U.S. military in the 1840s. So that's just one example.
I was going to ask you about Metaxas, and exactly for that reason, because the voice of the narrator, and I believe it's a captain,
Right.
who is filing this dispatch, the language used, the words. I mean, I had to go, frankly, to the dictionary for a couple of them. The language is really the language of 1840 and not the language of 2021.
Oh, yes. And the way they even use words would be different than they would use even words today. And so that required research. Another story set in 1538 about a conquistador traveling from Spain to the New World. I had to know something about conquistadors and about their boats and about their uniforms and their swords. A story about a waist gunner and a B-17 bomber in World War II. I had to know something about B-17 bombers. So the historical research becomes important.
And you have a story, A Good Table,
Yes.
which is very much present day Washington, based, I assume, on some of the observations that you made while you served here.
No question about it. The Good Table is about a phenomenon that exists only in Washington. Dan, you probably know it. It's the social climbers. There are people who are in Washington who their main focus in life, their vocation is getting invited to the right parties and hobnobbing with the right people. And believe it or not, they actually take on advisors. There are professionals who advise social climbers in Washington. And of course, the top of Mount Everest here is to be invited for dinner at the White House. So this is a story about good table. Why? Because the expression in Washington is to get good table, you have to give good table, if you know that expression. So in order to get invited to the right dinners, you have to invite people to your dinners. And it's all done scientifically with charts and maps and strategies. And it's about one of these couples.
Another story, Liberation, about a Holocaust survivor who succeeds. Ultimately, he's a good writer, and ultimately becomes a much admired writer. But the theme, as you end the story, comes back to his liberation, the day he was liberated from the concentration camp. Talk about how much the Holocaust has influenced your writing in this particular book.
So I have several Holocaust stories here. And obviously I'm grappling with the Holocaust all the time. I write about it, not just in fiction. One of my most recent articles in the Atlantic Monthly was about the Holocaust literature of Primo Levi, Aaron Appelfeld, and analyzing what made them popular in each of their countries. So I'm very much engaged in this also on the academic level. The story about liberation is a composite of many figures I've known from who were Holocaust survivors, and it's the price. It's the price of popularity, of fame, if you were. But it's also, what does it mean to be liberated? And are any of these people actually fully liberated ever from the concentration camp? Another story ties very much into my diplomatic activity. I, as the deputy to the prime minister in terms of diplomacy, was my last position in government. I undertook a great number of diplomatic missions abroad, and one of them brought me to Lithuania. Lithuania has a very close alliance, Dan, with Israel today, but we have an excruciatingly painful past with the Lithuanians. And visiting there and discussing our relationship with the foreign minister, who's a wonderful man, I mentioned that my family's from Lithuania, from a village that's about 70 kilometers outside of Vilnius. In Lithuania, it's called Aniškaya, but in Yiddish, it's called Anisht. And that's where my grandparents are from. And nobody survived this village, by the way. One afternoon, the entire village was taken up by Lithuanians and shot in the nearby forest. And when the foreign minister heard this story, he says, well, we've got to take you there. So the next morning they had a car waiting for me, and they brought me out to Anisht. And I saw basically the street where my grandparents lived. I saw this, it's called Synagoga Street. The synagogue is there. It's now a bakery. I saw the houses with the basements where people used to hide from the pogroms. My grandmother used to tell me about that. And I came away from this experience deeply moved, but uncertain how to put this into fiction, how to express these very profound emotions that were overwhelming for me. And I came home, and it took a while, but when I sat down to write, it turned out to be what I call a triptych. Several stories have three different parts, and the stories come together. And it begins not in chronological order to tell the story of a family from this village, beginning with the story of an 11-year-old girl who survives the Holocaust, goes back to her grandfather, who was a failed Talmud student, to her son, who was an Israeli politician of questionable morality. And it all comes together in the story called Anisht.
Anti-Semitism, it's a very real threat to Israel and Jews everywhere. And you weave in some of these stories the ever-present threat of it into the stories, some of the stories in your book. Do you think we'll reach a point where we can move past anti-Semitism as a central motif in Jewish literature, or do you think it's always going to be there one way or the other?
Well, I think it's always going to be there, and I think it should be there one way or the other. As long as it's anti-Semitism, we as Jews and we as Jewish writers should be addressing it always, and not trying to downplay it at all. And yes, I'm grappling with it. Another story that touches on anti-Semitism and also the theme of the Holocaust, a very strange story called The Reenactor. I don't know if you saw this one, Dan. I went on a government mission camps, like a March of the Living to the camps, and on the way to Auschwitz, we stopped at a Polish village that once had been inhabited by Jews. Of course, no Jews there now, but it had a Jewish downtown. It had Jewish restaurants and Jewish museums and a klezmer section, all run by local Polish people, but some of them were sort of Jewish reenactors and playing Jews. And so this is a story about a 26-year-old, failed, basically peasant who dresses up as a Jew every day and has to greet American tourists playing a Jew. And he himself is kind of an anti-Semite and is grappling with these central forces in his own mind. What is it to be a Pole? What is it to be a person who doesn't even know Jews, but also feeling in a strange way jealous of the Jews and the full lives they once had in this village?
Right, because at the end, I think we find him in the cemetery, and he is thinking about the accomplished, because he mentioned in the story the doctors and academics and others who once populated this village, this conflict. I think it's important, given the fact that as the Jewish communities in these countries, which are much smaller, are now beginning to grapple once again with anti-Semitism, even in places where there are very few Jews, or maybe I should say sometimes especially where there are places with very few Jews, I think makes the story extremely relevant. So you have adventure and mystery, you have irony, crime, suspense, familial relations, the supernatural.
Ghosts.
Ghosts. How do you how does this spring up? Where do the ideas come from?
But as they come to me, I don't go to them. And the process is almost always the same. All of a sudden, I'll be doing the dishes or whatever. I'll be at work in some way, and all of a sudden, the story will pop up. And my first reaction, almost invariably, is, "Oh no, that's entirely too wild. I can't possibly write that story." And then comes the terrifying moment where you sit opposite a computer and the empty page, and you say, "Oh, I don't know how I'm going to do this." Writing for me, I often envision as like creating a suspension bridge. Think about the Verrazano-Narrows Bridge. You got one side of the bridge on one shore, another side of the bridge on the other shore. You're not quite sure how it's going to meet in the middle, and that's the big challenge, is getting the story to meet in the middle. And what I found is that almost consistently, if I let the story reveal itself to me, it'll come out as out of the box as it can possibly be. And yes, I have stories about ghosts and stories about aliens. They just come to me.
So you've written fiction before. You have a couple of novels. Then you have the award-winning books, the New York Times bestsellers. Where do you see yourself going after this? More short stories? Will there be a novel coming up?
Out in April. It's called To All Who Call in Truth. Again, it's a very Jewish book. Big chunks of it take place in a suburban synagogue in 1972. I won't tell you what it's about, but it's about tension and murder, and also being a Jew in 1972 suburbia, not necessarily in that order. And I'm well into my second volume of short stories now. I think I just completed one this morning, and I'm engaged in already written the précis for a book about Israel's future. It's called Israel 2048, The Rejuvenated State. And I'm in the process of fundraising. This is not to fundraise on your dime, but for a book about Israel's creation in 1948. To do for the 1948 war what I did for 1967. My history, unlike my fiction books, my history books are very expensive. It doesn't cost to write a fiction book. History books involve, as you said, involves research. You've got to get to archives around the world. You have to buy media. You have to make maps. Books are very expensive.
How much of The Night Archer and Other Stories is autobiographical?
All of it, but in different ways. All of it, but in different ways. And I've been blessed to have a very varied career. I've been a soldier for many years. I've been in politics. I've been in diplomacy. I've been in academia. So you have stories about academia. And there are parts of my life that most people don't know. I was a period in Hollywood. I was Orson Welles' assistant in Hollywood. There's a whole story behind that. So we have a story about Hollywood. If you want to know where that story about Hollywood comes from, that's where it comes from. With a person very much like Orson Welles. And I want to draw on these. I've been in war, so there are war stories. But you don't necessarily know where the stories come from. So, for example, there's a story. I'll give you a good example. There's an unusual story about two old women in their 80s and 70s who are longtime lovers. And they're walking along the beach and talking about a painful incident in their lives. Now, what do I know about elderly gay women? And the answer is this. When I went to elementary school in the 60s, my teachers had been hired during the Great Depression. And during the Great Depression in the United States, it was very difficult to get a job as a teacher if you were a married woman. The assumption being that if you were married, you weren't the breadwinner in your family, so there were very few jobs. So they wanted to give it to people who were not married. And so many of these women turned out were gay. And by the 60s, they were older. Many of them had been in relationships, including one who was my favorite teacher, and the high school and the elementary school principal, who were lovers. That turned out later, I found out. And so that becomes the background for this story. Fossils, autobiographical, in a way, yes.
Let's talk about, if we can, to move to an area that you and I had many discussions about when you were here in Washington. That's the Middle East. We've just had this groundbreaking signing of agreements between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and Israel and Bahrain. Some comments, if you would, about the importance and the meaning of that, not only for the state of Israel, but for the Middle East in general, for the Jewish people. Because this is now being characterized as a warm peace, these agreements, as opposed to cold peace, which we've seen in the past. What are your comments? What do you think about this when you look at what happened at the White House here just a week ago?
So two perspectives. I've just framed this right. To my best of my knowledge, as one of the few really government who accompanied this process from the beginning. And I mean the beginning. I was an advisor to Rabin in the early 90s. And saw the Oslo process with all of its faults through. And then in this process, I was in the White House several times to advise on this process, and I've been closely, I can't say that I'm one of the architects of it, but certainly closely involved with it. And having said all that, I was actually invited to the White House ceremony. I couldn't go because of Corona, but it's stunning. It's a game changer. It's a total game changer. It totally overturns all of the assumptions of the peace industry in the United States. The notion that Israel had to give up territory to the Arabs to get peace, that the central conflict in the Middle East was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the core of that conflict was the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and the core of that conflict was settlements in Jerusalem. All wrong. All wrong. But I think, as you were intimating, what is perhaps most wrong is this notion that this peace is merely normalization and not real peace. Because we have had peace. We've had peace with Jordan, with Egypt, but without normalization. And normalization is worth 10 times what any peace is. And this has been a true normalization. The Bahraini foreign minister talking about how the Jews are indigenous to the Middle East, that they're part of our legacy, that they are our neighbors, they're part of our story in the Middle East. You never heard that from Anwar Sadat. You never heard that from King Hussein of Jordan, with all due respect to those individuals. This completely changes the paradigm for peacemaking in the Middle East. This is the new precedent. And every single peace agreement that will come, and there will be more peace agreements, will look like these agreements and not like the Camp David Accords and not like the Israeli Jordanian peace of 1994. They'll look like this. And my only hope, and I will never get involved in internal American politics, but my only hope is that irrespective of who wins in November, that nothing be done to disrupt this extraordinary process. Nothing can be done. And again, a stunning achievement.
You know, we talk about win-win, and it seems that this particular set of agreements is win-win. Yes, there is a common enemy and a common threat in Iran, but there are also all of these other issues of investment in high tech and medical technology, agricultural technology, the tourism factor, which has been written about almost every day. How important is win-win in this process? Because we've seen that it works, and you're saying that no longer will these agreements look anything like they were in the past. They're going to look like this. But how important is that as we move forward?
Well, what we're seeing is the wedding with two Ds of the most innovative country in the world with two of the wealthiest countries in the world. And that could be transformative, not just for the Middle East, but for the entire planet. I know of middle-level businessmen in this country have been contacted by their counterparts in the Gulf. It's an ineluctable and irreversible process that we've embarked on. And I think it's going to change so much for so many people. Now, I'm not being Pollyannish about it. There's going to be rough spots. We could disrupt this process by say, annexing parts of the West Bank precipitously. If we get into a fight with Hamas or Hezbollah, and that is not unlikely in the future, our response to that could also impact these new relationships before they've fully formed. So I'm not taking any of this for granted. But looking at the way this is evolving in a very, very short period of time is extraordinary. And I myself am looking at all sorts of opportunities of cooperating between Israel and the Gulf and even other countries and third countries outside in Japan. So it's kind of hard to see the light right now because we're in the Corona tunnel. We're in lockdown again. And it's extremely difficult for this country. And the mood in the country is not good. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. The mood is very, very down right now. But if we cannot lose sight of what has been accomplished, and what is accomplished is puts Israel in a place that, 41 years ago when I moved here was completely and utterly inconceivable.
Well, I want to go back on that note, just go back to the book for just a moment. I mean, I think it's, frankly, it's exciting that you wrote a short story this morning. So we're looking, hold the book up. We're looking forward to your next set of stories and to your next books. And really, Michael, we want to wish you really the very best. The book is The Night Archer and Other Stories, and is available online wherever you purchase books. Ambassador Oren, thank you for speaking with us about your new book and for your devotion to Israel and the Jewish community around the world. We really appreciate your being here today.
My pleasure. Shana tova, gamar chatima tova.
Thanks, and the same to you. A big thank you to Ambassador Michael Oren for joining me today, and thank you for tuning in to this conversation with B'nai B'rith. If you like what you hear, make sure you never miss a program by subscribing to the B'nai B'rith YouTube channel and liking us on Facebook. And be sure to visit our website, bnaibrith.org, to learn more about our important work. See you again soon. Take care, everyone.